do this? Lloyd replied that this was precisely why he was stopping the construction of the Apian Road. It was a dug trench leading up the mountain because he wanted to start mining coal. The main character threw the shovel behind his head and began to smile maliciously because he wanted to sell this coal at an inflated price. And as soon as the whole of their system reaches the masses, people simply will not be able to resist such a temptation. Xavier looked angrily at the smiling gentleman, who said that their residents would receive a discount, but a very small one, and considered it unfair. Lloyd looked closely at the dissatisfied knight and asked about whether he really considered him so ruthless. The protagonist kept his eyes on his knight and asked what would happen if he gave up on this idea, hinting that then they would hardly be able to pay off the debt for the estate. The blue-haired guy continued to look at the protagonist with displeasure. He immediately closed his eyes, holding the blade, and said that he would agree that now they had no other choice. Then Xavier looked at the protagonist again and said that the Baron did not know about coal, and when he found out, he would not leave it so easily. The knight looked at Lloyd, who lowered his head and explained to him that others had also tried to start mining again and again. The protagonist knew all this, so everything collapsed due to the fragility of the roadbed. Then he again smiled maliciously from under his brows and said that he would succeed. He imagined a huge technological drilling rig in the ground and said that thanks to modern technologies for excavation work, he would succeed because he knew the shield method of driving. The brown-haired man immediately raised the shovel over his head with joy and said that great things awaited them, but Xavier did not understand this technology unknown to him. At this time, a joyful Lloyd threw the shovel over his shoulder and walked forward, because Xavier wanted to see what this completely different gentleman could do. It was the same destroyed tunnel, littered with stones. This trench stretched straight to the entrance of the cave, which was littered with stones. It was a deep earthen cave. An ant's paw appeared. Then the antennae of an ant appeared. A bunch of red eyes peered out of the darkness. There were angry, bloodthirsty ants. These were large ants that crowded in this cave. Lloyd at this time clapped his hands. He began to rotate the magical green ring with a star with his hands, using spells. He then raised the ring above his head and emitted a green stream of light into the sky, wishing to summon a high-class apartment for himself. The green stream of light stretched far into the night sky. Then, the stream immediately evaporated into a shining star. Suddenly, a huge house returned with this stream of light. He wished he had such a cool skill. He sat at the table and boredly emitted green light into the drawing. He emitted green from his finger, trying to finish the drawing because it took too much time. Notification that this was a mid-level design, an underground outlet plan. He immediately leaned back in his chair and tiredly declared that he wanted to summon 100 immortal workers who did not need to be paid more. Then he put his hands on the drawing again and began to finish it. Thanks to the Newman incident, he was able to earn 639 RP, making a great impression on the Baron and Baroness, Xavier, Baron, and others. It was a table of the level system with basic measurements and design. Because he invested points in pumping up his skills, he managed to get them. He stood on a rocky path near a collapsed cave because he realized that they would be digging here. He looked ahead with his green grid skill because it was an available mid-level skill, the underground scanning dimension. He scanned the entire space of the cave with green light and saw a room there because this skill only allows you to see at a distance of 5 meters and will help you find the right direction. Then he stood with a puzzled look, touching his chin with his hand and trying to figure out how to drill a passage in the shortest time, because an ordinary person cannot do this, and besides, people get tired quickly. At this time, Peepodong was fast asleep under the blanket and fell ill while building the road. Even if he recovers, it will be dangerous to use it because it is too big. The main character looked around through his bangs with displeasure and realized that he had no other choice. A window popped up in front of him with a random selection of a mystical creature that he had enough points for. He was sitting on the path, legs crossed, when a green light of appearance began to radiate in front of him. It was a green portal from which a silhouette with a bow appeared. A snake girl with a bow on her head crawled out of this portal. This pink snake plopped down on the rocky path in front of the owner. This pink snake looked at the protagonist with admiration. The protagonist looked at her with bewilderment and assumed that at least she had poison, but she turned out to be completely harmless. But Peepodong also seemed like that at first, and perhaps this snake will be useful. The brown-haired man sat with his arms crossed and looked at the small pink snake, asking if she really increases in size after eating a sunflower seed and if she also has superpowers. To which he received a positive answer. Lloyd smiled and stretched out his hand and asked to show the snake all its abilities. This pink beast with closed eyes smiled widely. A few weeks later, this path led to a tunnel under construction in a cave. This snake was chained in a wooden barrel and dug a tunnel, eating the earth because the giant bell was moving inside the shield barrel. Then this pink snake chewed the earth because it was called a bell and had the skill of digging the earth level 1. At this time, the main character with a battered look stretched out his hand, while the huge bell crawled nearby and told Xavier to get ready. At this time, the naked knight in a sweaty state held the blade in front of him. Then the bell released hot streams of metal from its hole. The knight at this time swung his blade to knock down the flying metal rods. Meanwhile, the other blacksmith workers were trying to forge a reliable support on the forge. Step 5 was the realization of the harsh reality, as Xavier, with a dejected look, thought about why a knight like him should mess with the remains of a giant snake. Then Lloyd, with a towel around his neck, raised his hand and began to shout for the guys to continue working. At this time, the workers were pushing a wooden barrel into the depths of the cave, moving towards the goal. Lloyd wiped his face from sweat, looking at the empty pipe, because due to the lack of oxygen, his head was spinning, and if they had not brought the pipe here, they would have passed out long ago. Then the brown-haired man looked at the knight behind him, who said that it was time for them to stop, because like the other workers, he needed to rest. Lloyd turned his head and said that he was in charge here and should monitor the progress of the work, as a responsible person usually does. He looked through his long bangs with a dissatisfied look and realized that in Korea the bosses only know how to talk, and there are even such scoundrels who have never visited the place of work. So he swore to himself that he would never become like that and would monitor the entire process himself. Then he used his vision, scanning. He looked at the wall and saw a room with a green light where there were pieces of coal. He immediately picked up the shovel and began to rejoice with the rest of the workers that they were almost there and there was still a little left. Then Lloyd looked with a smile at the bell that was pressed to his face, and he thanked them for the fact that they did it many times faster. Then Lloyd looked back at the crowd of workers and his knight, giving an order that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they should dismantle the shield and expand the space. He looked at his workers near the stone wall and said that this was a rather dangerous undertaking, so everyone needed to be extremely careful. Then he looked back at the hole in the wall, hearing a strange sound. He continued to look at this layer of earth, listening to various sounds. He stared at the layer of earth with the other workers and realized that the earth cover here was strong and should not collapse. Then he began to look forward with a close underground scan with a green light. With this scan in the green room, he saw a crack in the wall and realized that it was not there before. He continued to watch this crack, seeing that it was growing. Suddenly, a huge bloodthirsty ant broke through the wall. Lloyd fell to the ground when the ant was about to attack him. Lloyd immediately grabbed his blade and was about to save his master. He swung his blade, looking at the bloodthirsty monster. Lloyd also did not want to stay aside and ran with his shovel. He delivered a crushing blow to the monster's head with the tool. With just one blow of the shovel, he flattened the ant's head. He looked at the corpse with a malicious look in the sweat of his brow and realized that this was an amazing thing, because something had appeared that was not said a word about in the novel. Then the knight together with the main character looked into a huge hole from where the black eyes of the other monsters appeared. These insects with a bloodthirsty look began to crawl in all directions. Lloyd immediately waved his hand at his workers, who began to run away in horror to the exit. At this time, Lloyd swung his blade and chopped all the monsters. The main character with an angry look, baring his teeth, tried to understand how many monsters were here, because if they got out, then they were finished. Xavier, out of breath, drew his blade, and Lloyd counted on him, but there was too little air here. At this time, the rest of the workers ran out of the mine, and he realized that it could not be destroyed without explosives, but even if the structure fell, there was a chance that the monsters would crawl out and tried to figure out what to do. At this time, Xavier slapped his master so that he would pull himself together and not panic. Then the enraged protagonist looked at the fighting knight and said that he did not panic, but thought. The angry knight looked back and said that he would not be able to hold back the monsters for long. Brown-haired held his shovel tightly, baring his teeth and thinking about what to do here with a tunnel with ants, coal, and a dungeon. It was an ordinary light bulb in a black space. Then this light bulb began to emit streams of discharges in all directions above the protagonist's head. Lloyd immediately grabbed the torch in the wall. He took his shovel and torch and shouted to the knight that they needed to move forward to attack. The blue-haired knight continued to grin furiously and realized that it sounded crazy, but he ran to attack. Xavier then deftly cut all the ant bodies with his blade because he realized that there was a point in this. The main character bloodthirstily ran to attack with his torch together with the knight. From the palace came screams that there was bad news for the Baron. Arcus opened his mouth in horror, hearing about the mutant ants and trying to understand where his son was. He immediately opened his armor cabinet, and the assistant said that all the workers were successfully evacuated, but Sir Xavier was still there and Baron would soon seal the entrance to the mine. Arcus immediately began to put on his armor and wanted to hurry, tightening his belt. Xavier bloodthirstily chopped the ants, from which blue splashes of blood flew. The knight held the blade in front of him, looking back with anger, trying to understand why there were more and more ants. The protagonist at this time held a torch and shouted that now was not the time for talking, because he was very busy. They stood back to back and fought off the mutant ants from all sides, because he understood that it was good that they did not come out of their holes, but the situation itself was very terrible. The knight bowed his head and fought with anger because he was almost at the limit and did not care that it was hot here and little air, but there were a lot of ants. At this time, the protagonist angrily bared his teeth using his scanning vision because he was trying to find methane in the dungeon. They continued to fight the ants, standing next to each other in the cave. He understood that coal was a place where methanogens were spreading, and because of this, layers of methane gas were hidden under all the mineral veins. He pulled out his burning torch and tried to understand. If he could only find it, he would blow up all the ants. Then he looked closely at his knight behind him. With his scan, he looked at the ground and saw a piece of a layer of methane gas. He immediately stuck his shovel into the ground and was about to dig. He spread his legs wide and began to dig the ground, looking back at the knight and giving him the order to hold off the monsters. He immediately began to furiously dig the ground quickly. At this time, a huge ant tried to attack him. Xavier at this time swung his blade. While Lloyd was digging, Xavier, at this time, dealt with the rest of the monsters. Cutting the air around with his blade, he cut down the monsters, protecting the master. They immediately covered their ears from the loud earthquake and noise. A huge main ant appeared. The guys raised their heads in horror and realized that it was the queen ant. This huge monster immediately began to attack the guys. At this time, the brown-haired guy and the knight held their weapons and stared intently at the monster. Lloyd tried to ask his fighter if he could defeat her, to which he received a refusal. The brown-haired guy ironically said that if he did not try, he would not know, although Xavier understood that there were things that he could not do even if he did not try it. The blue-haired guy put the blade behind his head and said that at the moment they still had no other choice. The queen ant furiously flew to attack. The knight immediately raised his blade and a blue core began to grow above it. He immediately attacked the belly of the queen monster with his blade. This bloodthirsty ant immediately fell into a stupor. The knight bloodthirstily stuck the tip of his blade into the monster's belly. Then he waved his weapon away from the monster. At this time, the brown-haired man continued to furiously dig the ground and understood that there was no time to lose, so he wanted his knight to hold out longer. At this time, the blue-haired knight swung his blade, fighting off the attack of the bloodthirsty queen of monsters. He stuck his shovel into the hole, and a stream of gas was heard from there. The brown-haired man immediately bared his teeth angrily in bewilderment. Lloyd immediately ran to his torch to grab it and told his fighter to run faster to the entrance. They began to run away from the cave and the monster was chasing them. It was an earthen cave where the chopped parts of the monsters lay, because they noticed a narrow passage that they had already used. The knight ran after the protagonist, who was holding a torch in his hands. Then our hero looked back, trying to throw the torch away. He immediately released a fiery torch towards the hole. This torch first hit the head and then flew off the ant. The fiery torch continued to fly into the depths of the cave, bouncing off the ground. The Queen of Monsters was about to finish off the prostrate main character. This flow of gas from the ground began to intensify. Suddenly, the entire space of the cave began to be enveloped in fire. A powerful fiery explosion occurred. The knight covered the master with his body when the explosion occurred. The ants watched the growing fiery explosion. It was a powerful surge of fiery energy. The knight continued to press the protagonist to the ground, protecting him with his body. At this time, Arcus, along with other knights and assistants, stood at the entrance to the mine. They tried to hold Arcus, who was about to run in armor to save his son. After the explosion, the battered Xavier continued to press Lloyd with his body. The brown-haired man at this time held his ears, grimacing. Then he began to get up, looking at the fallen Queen Ant and realized that her plan worked. Then he looked closely at the lying knight and realized that he protected him. Then he picked up the pink snake and apologized to her for being in such a state. Then he looked up at the entrance. He saw that their entrance was completely blocked. He began to get up, leaning his hand on the shovel, and his ears were ringing. A notification popped up that there was a lack of oxygen. He looked ahead with his scanning vision and displeasure. He again saw the entrance with the help of scanning and realized that he needed to dig through faster, but he also had to dig more than 5 meters. A bar with the oxygen level appeared, which was already running out. He stuck the shovel into the ground and was about to dig because they had no other way out. At this time, the battered Xavier raised his gaze. With his cloudy vision, he saw Lloyd digging the ground and shouting that they should get out together. The knight continued to lose consciousness and barely saw Lloyd's silhouette, who wanted to save them all. Then the blue-haired knight fell unconscious, hanging his head. A notification from the system appeared, which admired his act of not abandoning the knight. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of him had increased by +6. Received 108 RP, accumulated 157. The completely out-of-breath protagonist tried to catch his breath in the sweat of his brow. A notification with an oxygen level that was already on the edge. He understood that he had nothing more to lose and the oxygen level had noticeably decreased. The brown-haired man threw the shovel behind his head and frowned in the sweat of his brow, turning to the system because he wanted to find a search for knowledge that